Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Every negotiated settlement between the State of Israel and its Palestinian adversaries has failed to establish stable and lasting peace. This is the history of what was attempted, why those failures were inevitable, and what must be done instead. Every new American president has a plan to bring about peace between the Israeli and the Palestinians, and everyone fails. Every peace process has failed in its primary objective, to establish a stable and lasting accord between the two parties, such that they can live together side by side in friendship rather than enmity. But why? And what can be done instead? In his newest book, our next guest is unique in situating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the context of the global jihad that has found renewed impetus in the latter portion of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. Briskly recounting the tumultuous history of the peace process, he demonstrates that the determination of diplomats, policymakers, and negotiators to ignore this aspect of the conflict has led the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the world down numerous blind trails. This is often only exacerbated rather than healed this conflict. This new work also provides shocking evidence from the Palestinian media, as well as statements from Palestinian leadership showing that negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians will never work. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's the author of 19 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad, and the best-selling The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. You can find out more at jihadwatch.org. Here to talk about his latest book, The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process, is Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Great to be back. Thank you, Rabbi.
This history of hatred, and I always trace it back biblically to the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent in Genesis 3:15 as being this battle that's going to go on until Satan finally gets his head crushed. And that if you could cut off the line of the seed of the woman, well, then Satan would continue his rule. Once Jesus appeared on the earth and said he'd be back when the Jews call for his return, well, if you can get rid of the Jews, well, then Jesus never comes back. So I've always looked at it from strictly a biblical Toldot genealogy perspective, from a prophetic perspective, that nothing good's going to happen while Satan enlists the Pharaohs and the Hamans and the Herods and the Hitlers and the Ahmadinejads and the Ayatollahs and all these people to try to fulfill his diabolical plan to rule the world. But as we look at geopolitical constructs and the birth of a nation, we have to look at the multiplicity of the birth of the nations, plural. And the history, which you do such a great job of laying the foundation, I really want you to take us through the timelines and some of the historical milestones that brought about Israel's history, a lifetime of hatred. Talk about some of the myths surrounding Palestine and their very existence, because the world at large is completely ignorant of, is there such a thing as a Palestinian? And there's a simple one-word answer, and the answer is no.
That's right. The fact is that the Palestinian people were invented in the 1960s. They are a propaganda creation. They were designed in order to be a weapon against the existence of the State of Israel. That's what they're all about. That's why they exist. That's why, one of the reasons why this conflict is so virulent and never-ending, because you've got an entire people that was created for this conflict. It's not created in the way that other people are, and they simply exist. They have their national culture and their heritage and their history and their land and so on. The Palestinian people never existed at all until they were needed in order to try to defeat Israel with them, using them as a weapon. If you look back at the creation of the State of Israel, the modern State of Israel in 1948, you can read all the literature, you can read all the statements of all the politicians, and the United Nations statements, and the statements declaring the independence of Israel, and the statements of the surrounding states, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, declaring war on the new Jewish state. And nowhere, not once, in any of that literature are you going to find a single mention of the Palestinian people. And yet today, everyone takes for granted that there is a Palestinian people and the Israelis have stolen their land and are occupying it illegally and need to be evicted from that so that the Palestinian nation can be reestablished. The reality is there never was a Palestinian nation any more than there was a Palestinian people. What happened was you have the Arabs. Now, in the first place, this is the land of the Jews. It was called Judea. The Romans, in the year 134, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Bar Kokhba was a false messiah who led the Jews against the Romans in the year 134. He was defeated, and the Romans had had enough because the Jews had never accepted their rule, and they expelled them all from the area. They went into the Bible, into the Old Testament, to find a word, a name for the land, because they didn't want to call it Judea, the land of the Jews, anymore. And they called it Palestine, after the name of the ancient enemies of the Jews in the Bible, the Philistines. But there was no historical connection between anybody in that land and the ancient Philistines who had all died out. It was just a name that was plucked out of the book in order to taunt the Jews as they were being exiled. In those days, though, you didn't have modern technology. You didn't have the internet. You didn't have modern armies. And so the Romans ordered the Jews to leave, but they could not and did not make them all leave. And there was always a Jewish presence in the land because it was always considered to be, by the Jewish people worldwide, to be their ancestral land. And so some of them always stayed there in what was now known as Palestine. But with the creation of Palestine as a region did not create Palestinians as a people. It is the name of a region just like Brooklyn or Staten Island or Southern California. These things are not the names of distinct nationalities or ethnicities or peoples. And in the case of Palestine, there was no Palestinian people at all. It was just an area where Jews lived, and after the 7th century, Arabs lived, along with some Greek-speaking Christians who had been there with the Romans. And then the Arabs came in the 7th century, hundreds of years, maybe more than that, after the Jews first came to the area, and they conquered the land, of course, and ruled it, gave way to the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire fell in the year 1920s, the early 1920s, and one of the last acts of the Ottoman Empire was to cede the territory of what is now the State of Israel to the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. Now, the Ottoman Empire is the last country before Israel to own that land. When we're talking about occupation, that's very important because there is no Ottoman Empire today. So if Israel occupies the land of Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank as it's called, who is it occupying it from? Most people would say, well, it's the Palestinian people, but there is no Palestinian people. It's the nation of Palestine, but there's never been a nation of Palestine. It was just the name of an area. And so who owns the land? The Ottomans. Is there an Ottoman Empire today? There is not. So the land was given over to the League of Nations. The League of Nations then created what is known as the Mandate for Palestine, based on the Balfour Declaration of the British government from a few years previous. In 1917 was the Balfour Declaration, and 22 was the Mandate for Palestine, saying that Britain was going to administer the territory for the express purpose of creating a Jewish national home. And so that land belongs to the Jewish national home, because that was the State of Israel that was created. The land of Jordan is also the Jewish national home according to the original mandate for Palestine. But almost immediately, the land that is now the country of Jordan was detached from the mandate and given to the Arabs in gratitude for their supposed help in World War I, help for the British. The Palestinian people do not appear on the scene until the 1960s. I said before that there were Arabs there, and there were always Arabs there after the Arab conquest. They were not different ethnically, linguistically, culturally, or religiously from the Arabs of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, these areas as they are called now, from the Arabs of the surrounding areas, in other words. And this was the same in 1948 when the United Nations envisioned further partitioning the land to create a Jewish national home. It was going to create another Arab state, although there were already 22 existing Arab states. And the Arabs rejected this and kept pushing. But people immediately had problems with this because, after all, there were already those 22 Arab states. Why did they need another? And why could they not allow the Jews to live in their ancestral homeland? And so in the 1960s, the KGB, because by this time the Arab-Israeli conflict had become a part of the Cold War, the KGB had this canny, diabolically clever idea to create the Palestinian people and to claim that they were the indigenous people of the area, that the Jews were Europeans who came in and seized their land, excuse me, and destroyed their country, and that they were illegally occupying their territory. Now, this was all completely false and fictional, has no basis in historical fact, and yet it was accepted by the world, and now is taken for granted. And there is of course, there are several Palestinian organizations dedicated to what they call the liberation of their homeland. Although it's not their homeland, it was never occupied, and it doesn't need to be liberated. But this propaganda initiative has been extraordinarily successful, maybe the most successful propaganda initiative in the history of the world, such that you have billions of people, not millions, but billions of people believing lies, believing falsehoods and fictions, and never looking into it themselves. I'm sure that you take, for example, Mark Lamont Hill, the professor at Temple University who was a CNN commentator, and he was on CNN a couple of years ago saying, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And he was rightly fired for that because it's a genocidal statement. If Palestine is going to be free from the river, that is the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea, that means no Israel, and Israel would be destroyed, millions of Jews would be murdered, and so on. But I'm sure that he has no idea. I'm sure that this man, who's a professor at a respected university, doesn't have the slightest idea how the Palestinian people came to be or who is the legal owner of the territory that's supposed to be occupied. And he's just one example of the confusion and ignorance that reigns in this area. And that's one of the primary reasons why I did write this book. As you said quite rightly, it all shouldn't need to be said. It's all obvious to anybody who looks into this, even in the most superficial manner. But it does need to be said because so few people know it, and because there is such a cloud of misinformation and disinformation over it all.
It boggles my mind that the Bible, which, according to statistics, 1/3 of the population of the earth self-defines as Christian, would read in the Bible that the deed for the Temple Mount was recorded in the Bible as King David, in preparation for what he felt was an appropriate site to build the first temple that his son Solomon would build, went to Ornan the Jebusite, who was using that property as a threshing floor, and paid him and acquired the deed to that property. That's recorded in the Bible. It's no different than going down to your county courthouse and going through the records and finding a deed who was the first owner of this property. Are there any transactions, any liens, any transactions? Nope, this has never changed hands from this day forward. There is no recorded deed. There's no sale of this property. Therefore, the oldest, most uncontested deed must stand. And therefore, the Temple Mount, known as Mount Moriah, known as the place of Genesis 22, where Abraham took Isaac, has great meaning to the Jews, and this all occurred prior to there ever being a Muhammad, prior to there ever being an Islam, prior to ever there being a quote-unquote Palestinian. All this was signed, sealed, and delivered uncontested. But yet, in this world we live in today with, it doesn't matter, it is written, it's, well, now I've changed and we need to be more tolerant, we need to be more accommodating. Well, what if England wasn't so accommodating? What if England, after 1776, said, you know what? They're much more prosperous than when they were under our rule. They're doing things we never did. Let's wait 20 years, let them get established, let them grow, and we'll come back in and take it back.
They tried. 1812.
They did. They did. And how do we, as Americans, look at that war?
Probably most Americans don't know that one happened anymore, with education being in the state it's in. But I get your point that, of course, most Americans would say they had no business coming in at that time and burning down the White House and the other things that they did, because the country was established as independent, was recognized by internationally recognized treaties as independent, and consequently the British were fighting an invasive, offensive war. And it's the same thing that the so-called Palestinians are doing now. The reality is pretty much 100% the opposite of what people assume it to be. It's not the Israelis who are the invaders and occupiers, it's the Palestinians.
You know, I've been to Israel 16 times. I did research I had a best-selling biblical thriller that was based on the weaponization of the DNA of the Levite, using it to wipe out through a global plague that would only wipe out Levites, because there's only a genetic marker for the Levitical line. So this was all, of course, a beautifully made up story, but also fit with the Genesis 3:15 narrative. And during that time there, you clearly saw a green line. And that green line was, on one side of the road are Jewish families tending the land, flourishing, artichokes as far as you can see, beautiful groves of mangoes so big that you can't even imagine a mango coming out of Central and South America are dwarf. They're like little oranges. These mangoes are like watermelons. And you look across the other side of the street where they would call it the Palestinian territory, occupied territory, where they were given fully flourishing greenhouses. The Jews didn't, when they left the property, they left it intact. They didn't tear down the greenhouses. They didn't tear down the fences. They didn't tear down the draping. They handed it to them, willingly or unwillingly, handed it to them fully functioning, and they are now heaps of trash. And from an aerial view, you can see a green line. And that green line is on this side of the green line. On the green side are the Jews. On the gray side, and the message is profound, is that those who are trying to take over Israel hate the Jews more than they love the land.
No doubt about that. Yeah, you know, I have a similar experience. I was in the Golan Heights, and we're going through all this wonderful farmland and beautiful terrain. And of course, on the way there, crossed Lake Tiberias, and our guide was explaining to us how if you look up into the heights from Lake Tiberias, that was where the Syrian soldiers would stand and shoot down at Israeli farmers. And that's one of the reasons why the Golan Heights was so important to capture for the safety of Israeli civilians. But you can look, of course, from the Golan Heights into Syria and see very close by the border the city of Quneitra,
Mm-hmm.
where there were big battles fought during the 1973 war. And the Syrians never rebuilt Quneitra. They left it there as a ruin because their society is built on hatred. And they want to fan the flames of hatred against the Israelis. And so they use Quneitra as a kind of life-size museum of Israeli atrocities. Although the atrocities are trumped up, it was just a city that was caught in the middle of a war. And the ruin of it is blamed on the Israelis and so on. Meanwhile, in Israel, you have these farms flourishing where there had been soldiers shooting down at civilians, and you have in Israel all over areas where there were terror attacks and people killed and suicide bombers blowing things up, and there's no sign of it because everything has been built up again and people are going about their business there. They don't give in to any kind of hatred. They are above all that. And so here again, the narrative is about opposite of what reality is. And Barack Obama and others constantly behaved as if the obstacle to peace was Israel, when it's very clear that the obstacle to peace is the Muslim Arabs, and not just the Palestinians, but also those of the surrounding areas as well.
In looking at prior history, of course, the Ottomans, part of their strategy was that they would tax the trees that were on your property. And so, being good Jewish business people with the financial mind to reduce as much tax as I have to pay, cleared the trees from their property. And this is what created the environment that Mark Twain so describes, swamplands, because of the erosion, the problems with it. But the early settlers looked at it and saw the challenge, did research, found that eucalyptus trees absorbed a tremendous amount of water, and planted groves of eucalyptus, dried it up, and found that it was so fertile because all of the very fertile land that had washed down had created these wonderful plains. However, there were volcanic rock, and so as you're taking your drive up to the Golan, you see these pile of black rocks which had to be mined out of the land. It was backbreaking work, but yet the investment was made, and you see that the blood, sweat, and tears of the Jewish people to fulfill the biblical prophecy that this desert will be turned into a beautiful garden has come to pass. And we're only seeing it partially because it is of those other areas which are being settled that are not demonstrating a love of the land and wanting to be self-sufficient. In these failed negotiations, and there's many of them, and as a matter of fact, I have coming on at the 12 o'clock hour Yasser Arafat's former personal sniper, who had to flee Israel because he the only time he ever missed was when he missed King Abdullah, the hit on King Abdullah ordered by Arafat, and so he fled to America to avoid death. But you might know Tasseda. I don't know if you know Tassir.
Actually, no.
Abu Seda. He wrote the Mind of Terror and Once Arafat's Man, and so he gives the inside story from the PLO side, and he's now a believer, and he has a humanitarian aid organization operating out of Jericho, which is feeding the gospel to the Muslims, which is so incredibly important. But as we look at people like this that were propagandized, they were sold a bill of goods of independence and that could be delivered, and then watch the same corruption take place within the palaces of Yasser Arafat, of Muhammad Abbas, of the leadership slicing off the top for themselves, and the corruption that exists within the environment, but that doesn't make it into the Western media. And it's almost as if we're revisiting the time of the Pharisees, not wanting to give up power, the power of positions and the power of play and the authority. But there are millions of suffering people who, at the hands of these leaders, who don't really have a cohesive agenda. They don't have clarity. And as I looked through the various lists and compiled a list starting with the Madrid conference, going all the way through this Israel Peace Initiative, April 6, 2011, and then this latest one, I don't believe that there has been a proposal other than you just give Israel back to us. That's the only proposal on the table being put down. And I remember hearing that Arafat was offered 97% of everything he wanted.
Yes, that's right. That was toward the end of the Clinton administration.
97% of everything he asked for, but he had to acknowledge Israel's right to exist.
And more than that, though, because the Palestinian Authority has recognized Israel's right to exist, but it's a trick, because they have not recognized, and Mahmoud Abbas has said they will never recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And so what they're saying is that a country that is on that land has a right to exist, but also they want to drive all the Jews out of it and have it be another Arab state.
Right.
So that's not really recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That's the sticking point.
How have they gotten away with it for so long? There are some power players in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is now popping up its head as a new. They used to be a very bad actor for a long time in a lot of ways, and of course Mecca being there in Saudi Arabia, they had a great deal of influence. They stayed out of the political fray of the dynamics of the Middle East, and all of a sudden there's been a recent turn into new relationships, new negotiations. As we read biblically in the Ezekiel 38-39 coalition, Saudi Arabia is not a part of it. In fact, Saudi Arabia is not even in favor of this campaign of Armageddon. But yet they never exerted pressure. Whose thumb is on Muhammad Abbas? Whose thumb is on Hamas? Whose thumb is on the Islamic Jihad that could get them to line up, but chooses to engage in this jihadi? And I think that's in your view of this Palestinian delusion, that the jihadi key unlocks every door.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. That's the one reason why there's no negotiated settlement that has ever worked or will ever work. The Quran in chapter 2, verse 191 says, drive them out from where they drove you out. It's just that simple. Now, I show in the book that the Arabs were not driven out by the Israelis. That's a myth that the Muslim Arabs today propagate, but it's not true. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of truth here yet again. The Arab Higher Committee ordered the Arabs to leave in 1948 because they assumed that the Arab states would destroy Israel, and once Israel was destroyed, they could come back, but in the meantime, they were out of the line of fire. And that's what happened. That's why they left. But that has been transformed, like so much else, with this propaganda, so that most people assume that the Arabs were driven out of Israel. And that consequently, if you're a Muslim and you understand that or believe that you know that, then you think you also have a divine command, a command of the one true supreme God to drive out those who drove you out. It's in the Quran as much as the Ten Commandments are in the Bible. And so you have to do it. And that means that because it's in the Quran, it's a divine imperative. There is no negotiating away a divine imperative any more than you could sit down at a table and say, okay, we're going to negotiate away one of the Ten Commandments. It can't happen. It wouldn't happen. And so it's the reason why none of these negotiated settlements have ever succeeded, and the reason why none of them ever will. It's also the reason why all the Muslim states, especially ones that adhere more strictly to Islamic law, support the Palestinians, because it's an Islamic struggle. It is a jihad. It is not a struggle over this land, this piece of land, or that piece of land, or something of that kind. These things are more myths that American policy analysts all too often fall for, but they're just false. Now, whose thumb is on the scale? Who is making sure that they don't just realize that peace is in their own best interests? The primary culprit today is Iran. Even though Iran is Shiite and Hamas and Islamic Jihad are Sunni, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are funded by Iran. And that funding goes a long way toward explaining their fanatical intransigence and refusal to even entertain the possibility of some kind of peaceful settlement. Iran also funds Shiite Hezbollah in Lebanon, that is likewise dedicated to the total destruction of Israel.
When we look at the advancement, the underlying advancement of the caliphate, there is nothing in the construct of having a Islamic-led government across the world. It is by emigration, the EU without its borders became a farmland for the advancement of Islam. The impoverished nations of the South Sudan became a great opportunity for advancement. We're seeing it pop up in America. We're seeing accommodations being made, and it speaks to our 3%. If you get 3% to be loud enough, they'll affect legislation. So that's where the LGBTQ plus agenda came from 3%. So 97% of us are now under the control of legislation which fostered by and funded by the 3%. When it comes to issues like what's going on in the Middle East, there is a seeming set of bad representatives at the negotiating table. Almost like there are in our Senate and in our Congress, that they're acting on their own agenda, not the will of the people. Now, Islam is certainly not constitutionally based, saying that they're of the people, by the people, and for the people. But as we've watched for the last 3 years, we've had a Congress that is not of the people, by the people, and for the people. If you took a vote, people would say, no, we don't want you heading down this path. No, we don't want you spending these millions and billions of dollars doing these things. But they're representing their own interest, and that's what we see at the negotiating table. We also see the United Nations, who is supposed to be an advocate and a neutral party, is 95% votes against Israel. So there's an inbred hatred. But there is no compassion for the suffering, starving Palestinian that's actually out in the far reaches of Gaza, not up at the fence, not lobbing balloons over, but trying to live a life, build a family, and wish that they hadn't voted Hamas in, wish they didn't have this Islamic Jihad. Fatah was just another lipstick on top of the PLO, and nothing's changed. And based on this, Is there ever going to be a possibility of change?
Sure, there's plenty of possibility for change, but there is pretty much zero possibility of a negotiated peace. The unfortunate reality is that because the Palestinian war against Israel is a jihad, because it is based on the imperative, drive them out from where they drove you out, which is Quranic, there's no mitigating it. It's going to continue as long as there are people who believe that Muhammad is a real prophet and the Quran is a holy book. And so the only thing that can be done is for the problem to be managed, which is not quite the same thing as it being solved. There will always be some people waging jihad against Israel, but there are plenty of things that can and should be done that could blunt the edge of the conflict and make it a lot less of an ongoing, a running sore as it's been for all these decades, or a red hot ember. There's a lot of things that can be done that can cool it off. One of them is withdraw the recognition of the Palestinian people. There have been refugees all through the world. There have been conflicts all through human history, wars. There will always be wars, and there will be people dislocated by the wars who have to pick up and move somewhere else. After World War II, there was a tremendous dislocation, and there were people all over Europe who had to get up and move. There were Germans all over Europe who were exiled from the lands that they lived in because Germany is the aggressor nation, lost territory, quite rightly, and the Germans were quite rightly expelled from some of the surrounding countries, Czechoslovakia and others. And there were other peoples who ended up outside the boundaries of their nation states, and they got up and moved. In India, the nations of Pakistan, well, in those days it was West Pakistan and East Pakistan, or what is now Bangladesh, were created. Two Muslim states and the Hindu state of India. And the many millions of people got up who were Muslims and Hindus and left to go to the state that was going to be for them. So there were millions of refugees. But my point is that there are no more of those refugees.
Right.
Those problems are all solved. And in this case, unlike any other in human history, the United Nations, because of its venomous anti-Israel bias that you noted, has granted refugee status not just to the people who left the land of Israel in 1948, but to their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. So, Rabbi, I myself, my grandparents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire because they refused to convert to Islam. And they came to New York. My parents were born in New York, and I was born in the United States. So, I am not a refugee. My grandparents were refugees. I am not a refugee. But if I were Palestinian, I'd be a refugee with exactly the same circumstances, because the grandchildren of refugees are refugees if you're Palestinian. This is only to keep the refugee crisis alive as another stick to beat Israel with. And the existence of the Palestinian people also exacerbates the conflict, because if they were recognized as being simply the same as the local Arabs, as the Jordanians, the Lebanese, and the Syrians, then it would be a lot easier to prevail upon those nations to take them in. Just like the Germany took in the Germans, and Czechoslovakia took in the Czechs, and Poland took in the Poles, and so on after World War II. And India took in the Hindus, and Pakistan the Muslims, and so on. And if you had it recognized generally that this is not a distinct people, then you take away the impetus for their distinct state, which is all based on fiction and falsehood anyway, as I already explained. And you can say, go live in Jordan. There's plenty of room, and you'll be a boon to their economy if you're not spending all your time building rockets. This would go a long way toward easing the problem. But the recognition of the Palestinian people, which, as I show in the book, came about under duress when Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were in the Camp David talks, and Carter was in Sadat's pocket and was essentially giving Sadat everything he wanted, he pressured Begin to accept language in the concluding documents, accepting that there was a Palestinian people. Begin tried to explain to him that there was no Palestinian people, that these were just Arabs like the other Arabs, and Carter would not hear of it. And so we have Jimmy Carter to thank for the existence of the Palestinian people. And it's been no good to the world since this propaganda has been accepted.
It's hard to, when Egypt, who in this new peace agreement that was proposed by the Trump administration, had said we will open up a part of Egypt to house this population and open up the gates, allow them access, give them, help them. These are human beings that want to be productive, and they're refugees within their own community. They're hostages within their own community who are funding and building the jihadi war machine. And that seems to be their entire purpose, is assembling weapons and staying in the background. And you have two contradictory factions. You have Hamas, whose by very name in Hebrew means violence. Then you have, maybe Hamas wasn't violent enough, so Iran begins to fund Islamic Jihad to take over for Hamas as the action arm while Hamas does whatever Hamas does, and the people are still suffering. You have an aging Muhammad Abbas. Who knows who the heir apparent is going to be to Fatah, and if Fatah will remain Fatah, which is the PLO with lipstick, or if it will be absorbed into something else. It's so volatile, and yet Israel is trying to restore worship on the Temple Mount, the rebuilding of the Third Temple, moving towards more laissez-faire, more status quo, and allowing for some cooperation, some cooperative living. Arab citizens of Israel don't want to be a part of the Palestinian movement. They want nothing to do with it. They're Israelis, and they want their children growing up with Jewish kids and Israeli Christian kids and Ethiopian Jews and speaking Hebrew and Arabic and English and getting a great education and becoming doctors and scientists and having all that opportunity. Who wouldn't want that? That's why my family came to America. That's why my father came. That's why my mother's family came, was so that we would have an opportunity that we wouldn't have in a little shtetl in Galicia. So there's a disinformation machine working within the Palestinian world that is then governed and ruled by a group that has nothing but their own interest at heart, but yet has paid off, bought off, somehow obtained this leverage within the United Nations that their causes, that Israel is portrayed as an apartheid nation who is perpetrating atrocities. And I go back to what Golda Meir said. She said to the Arabs, she said, "We can forgive you for killing our sons. What we cannot forgive you for is forcing us to kill yours." That's the Jewish heart. And nobody knows of this. Nobody understands this. The world certainly doesn't look at it that way. And they continue to see that every time that somebody lobs a acetylene bomb over the fence and there's a shot, a rubber bullet shot fired at that person, that's an act of aggression. Or that 10,000 rockets are fired at Ashdod and Ashkelon. And finally there's a response, and they say, well, it was an inappropriate response. Fire one rocket on New York, what's going to happen? It's going to be a disproportional response. We're going to take you out. So it's been such a double standard, and it is this indoctrination, especially through organizations like CARE, operating in America, the anti-Jewish hatred that is now sweeping through Europe again, that we hear things that make us think it's 1939 all over again. And, is this how God is going to bring the Messiah back? Is there a larger eschatological picture here that we can explain and we can understand, that we're probably never going to get there until the Prince of Peace arrives, until the Son of Perdition is made known, until there is a temple, a third temple, the tribulation temple is on the Temple Mount, and the abomination of desolation takes place, and then everybody understands exactly where we are in the Bible, because the Bible has survived and foretold all of these things, not to the extent of how far the hand of Ishmael has gone, from the 12 to the 55, but we see that there's great confusion. Not only is there throughout the world, but in the region.
I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of the region.
Within Israel, within the Middle East. If Iran, if Turkey and Russia are to be the key players of Ezekiel 30 and 39, and they're in a tiff right now. That's foretold, that before they become allies, they will be enemies. We're seeing that play out. But we're also seeing new alliances being formed with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan still being somewhat Switzerland in a lot of these situations. There's not clear divisions which are going to bring about a clear campaign and a clear siding. And that's what kind of has the region in a state of limbo, is that it can't really move because it's hemmed in by these immovable parties. And certainly the Fatah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad are immovable parties. They will not yield until they get what they want.
No doubt about that. Yep. And one thing I can tell you is that one of the reasons why the United Nations is so set against Israel is because of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 Muslim governments. It's 56 countries and the Palestinian Authority. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, is the largest single voting bloc. It always votes as one at the United Nations. So they get pretty much their way, because if you have 57 votes guaranteed on the one side already, and then all the friends and allies of those various countries, you're pretty much going to be able to do whatever you want. And so it's kind of crazy how Israel is now condemned on a routine basis and demonized regularly by the United Nations, while actual human rights abusers, nothing is said and nothing is done.
So the sober reality is, in this Palestinian delusion, is that it's going to be, if there's going to ever be, Israel's going to have to make incredible concessions, including their non-negotiable that you must recognize us as the Jewish state. And
that's non-negotiable, and that's the one thing that the other side will never accept. So it's an irresistible force against an immovable object.
So the future of the region is in complete disarray, and we can expect more of the same?
No doubt about it. And there will probably be another president later who will try to come up with some new peace agreement, which will fail again. Although maybe that's an even too optimistic, because if the Democrats elect the president in 2020 or 2024, they're probably going to break the alliance with Israel and abandon Israel. I don't think that would be the end of the state of Israel, but it would be a great tragedy for the United States as well as for Israel. And I hope it doesn't happen.
Well, as much as I believe in the Bible, I believe that the curse of Genesis 12:3 would fall upon this nation. It would throw us immediately into recession. We would see the economic times like we hadn't seen since the Depression. God says, I'll bless those that bless thee, and I'll curse those that curse thee. He also says that never again will my land be divided. So any proposal to divide the land is anti-God. Any proposal to withdraw support for Israel is anti-God. And God has already said it. This was not, when he made his covenant with Abraham, it was an unconditional covenant. Abraham had not yet had to do anything. It was only after God confirmed his covenant with Abraham that he asked him to give him a sign of confirmation of his covenant with God. And this is the covenant of circumcision as defined by these borders that were clearly given to Israel, that Israel has never had sovereignty over. There's never been a point in history since those words were spoken that Israel has ever had sovereignty in that God-appointed land. So at the beginning of the show we talked about there's no Ottoman Empire. There's no British Empire. There's no Roman Empire. There is no Egyptian Empire. There's no Mamelukes. There's nobody who's ever stood, no empire that's ever stood against Israel stands today. And that's over a 4,000-year period of time, which is empirical evidence that if you stand against Israel, you will ultimately fail. It used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire. And then what happened? In 1949, they backdoored Israel with a side deal with the Arabs, and all of a sudden their entire empire collapsed. Look at the former Soviet Union. That was an intact empire that stood against Israel. And what happened to them? There is no more Soviet Union. So as we look at America, we have to be very sober in our decision and our position about where we stand on Israel, because it is the epicenter of all global economies, all global enterprise, because it's the spiritual capital of the world. And as a Jewish believer in Jesus, it is the place of his return. It's the place in which he rules and reigns. It is our desire as believers to ultimately wind up there. And that is something to look forward to. And it's not going to be Jesus calling the Palestinian Tower, asking for landing rights and what runway should in East Jerusalem should he arrive at, and what gate should he taxi to. Just doesn't make much sense in this economy. Robert Spencer, a brilliant mind in a confusing season that is not confusing in any way, about the catastrophic history of the Middle East peace process. The key has always been the Quran and the advancement of the caliphate. And anything which erodes, and even the establishment of the fact that since Islam was once sovereign in the land that's called Israel today, that because it once was under their rule, it will forever be under the rule by edict and mandate of the Hadith and of the Quran, and therefore not ratified by any other nation, ratified by themselves as an absolute squatter's rights and power and authority over anywhere they ever set their foot. So you're fighting against an ideology, not a religion, and an ideology has the component of a war machine where a religion does not. Robert Spencer, always crystal clear, always a rapier grasp of the situations, calling it like it is. If people want to know the truth behind what's going on in Israel and this, quote, Palestinian delusion, this is a book which will explain it all to you, and you will walk away understanding that as long as there is the agenda of the caliphate and the action, an act of jihad, that there will never become a place fully recognized as Palestine, because you cannot make something out of nothing. There are no Palestinians. How do you give somebody who doesn't exist a place to govern and rule a people that don't exist? It is a delusion. And we thank you, as we always do, for being such a great guest. Robert, so good to see you again.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.